Welcome to The Other 51, the podcast where your favorite writers tell their secrets and talk about their craft. My name is Brian Moritz. Thanks for joining us wherever you get your podcast. And this show is particularly special, and not just because our guest this month, though that's a huge reason why it is special, but on or about this week, 10 years ago is when The Other 51 debuted with its very first episode. So I can think of no better person to celebrate 10 years of The Other 51 with my guest, a musician, a podcaster, and now the author of America's Founding Son. He's been on the show before. Delighted to have him back. Bob Crawford, welcome back to The Other 51.
Brian, thank you for having me. And I remember being on here, and I remembered it was a very long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
So you and The Road to Now, we started at about the same time.
We've kind of had parallel lines. Yeah, your podcast with Ben Sawyer, who's been on the show as well, my show as well. 10 years to you guys, so congratulations. And it's delightful to be able to do this long.
I'm happy to talk to you again.
Yes. So so starting off with the book, America's Founding Son, the full title, John Quincy Adams, From President to Political Maverick. It is such a delightful book. I learned so much reading it. I loved it. It was a fun read. It was fabulous. So I'm curious, just to start off, as someone who reads so much just for fun and for learning, what was that moment like for you when you first got a copy of the book with your name on it?
Oh man, it was like, there's the process. I learned so much about the writing process and like the publishing world, right? I'm really familiar with the music business and that whole process of the album being made, but I'd never experienced the book. And there are some things that are similar and there are some things that are different. But so I had received a copy of what they call galleys, which is kind of the unedited book, but it comes bound. And there's a cover on it.
And it's got your name on it.
It's got your name on it. And so I had that. I had that for a while. And it's like paperback and whatnot. But then when the box came with the books, I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't told, hey, your book's coming. And so I guess the book came out in March, probably late January, early February. I go outside and there's like a delivery, and that's not unusual. There's deliveries kind of going on all the time. And I bring the box in. I'm like, what is this? And I cut it with a knife, opened it up, and I cut the covers of the books that were on top because I didn't know what it was. I didn't like completely sever them, but whatever. I kind of ruined them. And I like, because people make these unboxing videos.
Right.
And so it's like, I kind of had to redo my unboxing video, but I didn't know what it was. And, yeah, man, I held a copy in my hand, and it was like, I did have this moment of savoring this, like, wow, like this is real. Like this is a real thing. And, you go through this process of, it's a book proposal, and then I got the book deal. I signed the contract, and then I had this moment like that. I kind of put that moment. I had this great joy and excitement, followed by an equal sense of panic and fear, because I got the deal to write the book, and then I realized I had to write the book, and that terrified me. But then you go through the process of writing it and researching it, and and here it is. It's a real thing. So yeah, it is a wonderful, exciting thing to hold. It really is.
So you mentioned we've talked before the book kind of started as a podcast that you did, Founding Son, the podcast series, and we talked about that a few years ago. So, and this is a very different than the podcast. So a lot of similarities, but it's different. So can you kind of walk me through the process of how you did that process, that podcast then turned into the book idea, then into the book?
Yeah, the whole process of writing the podcast and working on it, we had 6 episodes to tell this story, 6 30-minute episodes. And I worked with a producer / story editor, James Morrison, who I work with on American History Hotline. And when we first started working together, we had this, I forget what the Giro, what Zero? There was some software where you storyboard, and I would send him pages of timelines and notes and scenes and things, and he would dump them into this like storyboarding software, and like it quickly became evident that a lot of stuff wasn't going to be able to be in the podcast series. A lot of the story I wanted to tell.
Okay.
And in particular about these two abolitionists, Benjamin Lundy and Theodore Weld. I feel like they're just at different times I wanted to write a book about each of them. And I think there's like so much to tell about them as individuals. And because I would read a biography of John Quincy Adams and you would have a paragraph here or a sentence there about these gentlemen. But I really felt that their relationships with Adams told us so much about Adams.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I always knew I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to tell their story. And the book was the opportunity to do it. And as well as fill in a lot of the holes that, you know, inevitably a film adaptation or a podcast, it's going to leave a lot of holes.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Weld and Lundy because I have them in my notes. I wish I could show it to you to prove that I'm not just saying that. But yeah, those are two stories that I didn't know anything about. I never heard of them until I read the book, and I'll get to them individually in a second. But curious about the expanding the book out like you did, and I'm curious your thoughts on this because it's about John Quincy Adams, but it's as much about America at the time of John Quincy Adams and that like period between the War of 1812 and the Civil War and that era. So I'm curious, you know, how did you guys come to that decision, and how like did kind of centering John Quincy Adams in that space kind of help you, or how did you come to that as kind of like the narrative of the book?
Well, when I pitched the book, I pitched a beach read.
Okay.
And so I knew it couldn't be a cradle to grave, and I didn't really want to write a cradle to grave, and I have nothing inside of me that wants to write a cradle to grave about anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew I had to narrow the scope because Adams's life goes off in so many different directions. Like there are things that he was involved in that I didn't even mention in the book.
Okay.
Like the Smithsonian and how important he was to the establishment of the Smithsonian, because I knew I needed to narrow the scope, and I needed to keep the focus on slavery.
Okay.
Like I decided the book was about his relationship with slavery, more specifically, the nation's relationship to the issue of slavery between the Missouri Compromise or the Missouri Crisis, 1819, to Adams's death in 1848. And so that helped me tell a narrow tale. And that meant I had to let go of, like, just as writing a book, I could put more things in than I could in a podcast series. I still had to stay focused and keep the camera, if you will, in one specific direction.
So this is going to sound very weird, but I'm hoping I can phrase it right. You know, focusing on Adam's relationship to slavery and slavery as the issue. Obviously, that's one of the things I learned in the book, and it's reinforced it, how dominant this was in American political life and how like it was the issue up until that. Was that the reason you picked it? Or was there another reason that kind of jumped out to you as the issue to frame his life and his story around?
Well, could you imagine living in America in the 1820s, 30s, or 40s, even 50s, where you could not conceive the end of slavery?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Like there's just no possible way that an American citizen, North or South, could ever see a day when slavery would not exist. It was big business. It was if we think about the big pharma or the gun lobby, or like it was all tech. It was all of those things, and so, you know, I wanted to create the sense of that. And also for Adams in particular, it is the issue on which he finds his redemption. It is the issue on which my belief is he defines himself as the greatest public servant in American history. And it's largely upon that issue. And the issue of freedom of speech, which kind of was his way into the anti-slavery issue. It was he didn't believe that the Constitution is written permitted the federal government from interfering with slavery in the states where it had existed.
Mm-hmm.
But he did believe that people had a right to petition their government for the end of slavery. And that becomes the issue becomes freedom of speech in 1836 when the Southerners in Congress with their Northern allies passed what's known as the gag rule, which means that you could not mention slavery on the floor of Congress, which meant citizens who were sending petitions to their congressman to be read, and there was time. The First Amendment, you can petition your government for a redress of grievances. Right. That is a form of free speech, just as important as freedom of religion, of the press, the right to peaceably assemble. So when a citizen's right to petition their government was taken away, Adams saw that as a breach of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, and that's how he ultimately became an anti-slavery activist.
So getting back to Theodore Weld and Benjamin Lindy, like I said, I loved learning about them. And I found it very interesting how this book, it focused a lot on them and not on kind of the people already might know from that era, right? There's not a lot of William Lloyd Garrison. There's not a lot of Frederick Douglass in this book. And they pop up, obviously. But I'm curious, kind of a multi-part question, but how did you learn about these two individuals, and what was it when you were starting the reading or starting your research, even back to the podcast, that kind of tickled your brain a little bit and is like, ooh, I want to learn more about these two and write about them and their importance to the story?
The first place I learned about them was Sean Wilentze's Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, which was really where I learned about John Quincy Adams first. And then every time, if you read a biography about John Quincy Adams, these men pop up.
Okay.
And so the big difference, when I got the contract to write the book, I had already done a few years of research into John Quincy Adams. I had a general idea of where to find those sources and how to tell that story, and the aspect of him. It really was tracking down these other two guys that was that initial research, intensity of research. And so for Lundy, he was a Quaker, and he's born in New Jersey, and he moves to Wheeling, Virginia at the time. It wasn't West Virginia, it was Virginia at the time. And he becomes a saddle maker. And he sees a slave coffle, a parade of enslaved men chained together, walking down Main Street in Wheeling, heading to the river, where they're about to be literally sold down the river. And he makes this promise to God that he will break one link in the chain of slavery. Mm-hmm. And he sets about doing this by starting an anti-slavery newspaper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And so in doing the research, I knew, well, first I searched out books about him, and he kept a diary, and then someone published a book about him based on his diary. And so I got my hands on that. That's easy to get your hands on. And then there was one book, it was published in the 60s or the 80s. I'm looking at it right now. The Benjamin Lundy and the Struggle for Negro Freedom. And so I got that. And then there was like a book about Weld called Passionate Liberator. And that's very old as well. That's decades old for sure. And so this is where I started. But then I realized that I needed to get my hands on copies of The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And there's some of those are available at places like archive.org, or you can find them JSTOR, mm-hmm. which is an academic platform, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I pay a fee to subscribe to that. And if you are a professor or work at a college, you probably get that for free. Mm-hmm. And so I did work those channels, and then I found out that most of the copies of his newspaper are held in Columbus, Ohio. And so I called that library, and I said I need to get I knew I couldn't get there physically, and so they gave me a list of genealogists who work locally. and they said you can hire them to gather your documents. So I hired a genealogist, and she scanned all of these newspapers for me.
Oh, wow.
And so that's kind of how I kind of like the research process. Like I did go to Massachusetts Historical Society. I went to a few other places, but I did a lot of that kind of like I kind of understood what I was looking for generally, and I would get a hold of documents sometimes like that.
When you're writing this, what kind of a challenge is it for you as a writer to really be introducing somebody, a person like Theodore Weld or Benjamin Lundy, in a way that, John Quincy Adams, you're introducing, but if you're reading a book about John Quincy Adams, you kind of have like a shorthand of who he was and when he was president, to really introduce somebody like Weld or Lundy and their importance to this story and to Adams's story. What was what were you looking for? How were you doing that as a writer?
So the important thing was like I could build the biographical sketches and tell the story of these guys, but I needed to find a way to make the book coherent while telling three biographies.
Right.
And I knew of course, their paths intersect, right? And so the main thing I did was I stuck to chronology as much as I possibly could, and that helped. But as I got through the writing as I was working through the writing process, I realized that what Lundy and Weld were providing us was that finger on the pulse of the country. You know what I'm saying? They represented what was happening in the activist community of the time, which that anti-slavery community, the abolitionists, it was a very small minority of a minority. And each man, Lundy and Weld, represented and were part of different generations. You mentioned William Lloyd Garrison, who is the most well-known, right, of these white abolitionists, I think. Garrison comes to anti-slavery through Lundy.
That was fascinating to learn. I didn't realize that.
And I was fascinated to learn that as well. Lundy was very pragmatic in his abolitionism. Garrison would not be. Garrison was far, maybe today we would say far left, extremist. Because not only at one point is he talking about ending slavery, he's saying if the Constitution allows slavery, damn the Constitution, damn government. He was calling for anarchy. He was saying if the Bible condones slavery, damn the Bible. No God, no government. And he was super radical because he thought women should have the full citizenship, the right to vote, and women should be able to be involved in the cause. And so he was farther, I guess, to the left, or I don't know in our parlance of our times, but he was more radical, way more radical than Lundy. That's why they part ways. And he's more radical than Weld. And so I wanted to kind of show that, but again, keeping the camera on Adams as much as possible and tell the Adams story, because Adams thought Garrison was a wacko, and unrealistic. And not only were his tactics not successful, or in Adams's opinion, not going to be successful, they were actually hurting the cause. And so that was the way I focused on Lundy and Weld rather than like Garrison. I knew I had to tip the hat to Garrison, and I knew I needed to tip the hat to David Walker, a black abolitionist. And there were other black, like we know a lot more about a lot of the black abolitionists who were around the time. I really didn't cover them. I was just trying to, again, write something that was narrow in scope, but told an important story.
Well, and the timing of it plays a role as well, because if you're doing this, reading this through and writing this through Adams, he's active in the 1830s and then dies in the
Right.
1840s. So a lot of
Yeah.
the Garrison comes now, he's active, but he really comes into focus later. So that chronology, I'm sure, helped kind of frame
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
story. This is a snapshot in time in American history.
Exactly. It's really about the 1830s and 1840s,
Hmm.
1820s, 30s, and 40s. And Lundy will be dead in 1839, and Weld will play a very big role in Adams's fight in Congress against slavery, but he'll completely leave the movement, you know, by 1844, 1845. So yeah, these people are very relevant to the anti-slavery fight, but they're relevant at a period before which abolitionism really became a powerful force.
Hmm.
These are the early years. Because when Lundy's begins to be active, the abolitionist movement is very scattered and not coherent. During Weld's period, it becomes religiously focused and more coherent, and he starts to get some money behind it. And then after my story ends is when it makes its way into politics. But like the issue of slavery kind of like breaking into political relevance begins with John Quincy Adams.
So you mentioned earlier that you had the excitement of signing the book deal, then the dread of, oh my gosh, now I have to write a book. Walk me through the writing process. Obviously, you had a lot of material from the podcast that you did, and you've been reading and thinking about John Quincy Adams for a very long time. You're also an incredibly busy man as a husband, a father, a touring musician, a recording musician, all this stuff. So how did you what was the actual sit down and write a book process like for you?
Well, when I was on the road, it was that actually was a very conducive to writing. Like that, like we, we are on a bus and we drive in the night, and I'm up like 6, 7 in the morning anyway, and then we don't have sound check until 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So I really did get a full work day in
Okay.
many days
Okay.
on the road. And then when I was at home writing, it would be kids at school, or it would be late at night, or it would be early in the morning.
Okay. And tour buses are not known for their spaciousness inside, especially with the touring band that you guys have. So, did you? I'm assuming there was a lot of digital archives that you were working on, or were you
Yeah.
okay
Yeah.
carting around the books on them?
No, no. I mean, well, yes, I did have a tub of books, for sure. Yes, I had one of those big tubs filled with books at different points.
Okay.
But all the congressional records are available online. Adams's 14,000 page diary is available as a database online through
Okay.
the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so I told you about the other documents I would get scanned, or letters here, letters there. So yeah, a lot. I mean, it was, we live in a great, and I thought about this many, many times through this process. Man, I live in an amazing time. And even with like some of the books, like not all of them, some of them were very old, from like the 1920s, 1950s. A lot of those books aren't available on Kindle, but a lot of the works from the past 50 years at least that I drew from, I could get them on Kindle. So I would often have a physical print copy of a book. I have the Audible version if it's available, and then I have the Kindle version.
Okay.
So it's expensive, but you can carry around a Kindle, some books, and a computer, and you're well on your way.
We're getting to the end here, and I just want to kind of get back to John Quincy Adams at the center of the story. And you've written a book about him, you've done a podcast about him. Spending all this time, you've read a lot of his diary. Kind of looking at it as a whole, what makes him for you such a vital and fascinating figure?
He's America's greatest public servant,
Okay.
hands down. I mean, because you can think about the presidency and how You rise to the top to be like the very best, and in politics, becoming the president of the United States, you're the most powerful man in the world. But Adams, his success or his career didn't begin or end there. Like, he is appointed to his first diplomatic post by George Washington. He serves in multiple positions in the diplomatic corps. He ultimately becomes the minister, well, under Madison, he's the minister to Russia. He negotiates the War of 1812 for the Treaty of Ghent. He's the head of that. He's the head of that commission. He becomes Monroe's Secretary of State. He's the architect of the Monroe Doctrine. He negotiates Florida into the United States, America's claims to Oregon. He becomes president in, I think, the most controversial, craziest election in the history of our country, 1824. He has a terrible presidency, but then he goes into Congress, and he serves there for 17 years. And while he's in Congress is where I believe he gets his redemption. And during that time, which I believe is specifically his redemption, is representing the slave captives from the Amistad before the Supreme Court and winning their freedom. And then he dies in Congress at his desk. So, I just don't think you can't say he's the greatest president. You may be able to, there's an argument to say he's the greatest Secretary of State, but he's absolutely our most extraordinary ex-president, with all due respect to Jimmy Carter. And I think he is our greatest public servant.
All right. As we come to the end here, I'll get us out of here on the question that I ask all of my guests. I've asked you several times, so I always look forward to the answer. What is the best thing that you've read lately?
There is American... Hold on, I want to get this right. The Library of America.
Okay.
You familiar with that?
I'm not.
Those
no.
books? It is a company, I believe they're a nonprofit. And they publish like the papers of bound editions of the papers of Washington and Adams, and they have like an edited edition of John Quincy Adams' diary, and they just put out a book about the Declaration of Independence.
Okay.
And speeches and writings about the Declaration of Independence, and there's 2 Adams speeches in there, but it is called The Living Declaration.
Okay.
The Living Declaration. I highly recommend it, especially at this time.
Right.
As we're coming up to the 250th. It's got speeches by Reagan and Obama, and it's John C. Calhoun, John Quincy. It is all these different politicians and their takes on the Declaration of Independence.
Very, very cool. Very cool. That is Bob Crawford. You can get Founding Son at the links in show notes, as well as links to all of his podcasts. And this has been great, Bob. Thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it, man.
And thank you for listening to The Other 51. We do this monthly, and you can also read my work at Sports Media Guy over on Substack. Jen Moritz is our graphic designer. Ellie Moritz wrote our theme song. I'm Brian, and I will talk to you next time.